In ancient times, some things happened about 18 inches lower than they do now. That is to say, the seat of the emotions was not the heart, but the bowels, and the seat of thought, of intelligence, was not the head, but the heart. So when these two disciples say to one another, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road?" they're not really talking principally about an emotional experience, but an intellectual one. As Christ explains to them their story, the story of Israel, the scriptures of Israel, and explains to them how he is the one who makes sense of all that story, they have an intellectual epiphany. Now, this kind of intellectual satisfaction is not just something merely sort of academic, abstract, and dry. It's not the satisfaction that one gets, real though it is, from finishing a crossword or correctly parsing a Greek verb. It is rather something which is genuinely exciting, genuinely satisfying, something that finally makes sense of everything. And that obviously brings with it emotion, joy, excitement, passion even. Christ finally has made sense of the story of Israel. It turns out, in retrospect, that when you look back over that great range of history, from the very beginning, even until the time of Christ himself, you see that there is a sort of hole in it. It builds up around this gap, and that gap Christ has filled. And just in the same way, our stories, because we are the successors of the people of Israel, our stories have a gap in them until that gap is filled by the risen Christ. This St. Peter has realized by the time of Pentecost, and so he's able to show in his great Pentecost speech the many ways in which Christ fills that gap created by the story of Israel. And we heard today just one example of that, when David in the Psalms prays that he might not be constrained by death, that death might not for him be the end. And Peter says, quite rightly, of course, well, David did die. So what happened to his confidence that God would not allow the grave to swallow him up? That confidence of David was a gap, a hole, which has now been filled by Christ. And David wanted more perhaps than he knew that he wanted. He might have thought that what he wanted was simply not to die, an understandable thing. But when Christ fills the gaps in our lives, he fills them in a way which is quite unexpected, which gives us so much more than we ever dared to ask for. When C.S. Lewis writes about life after death in the Psalms, he points out that there's hardly any of it at all. The people of Israel before the time of Christ barely dared to hope for life after death, for resurrection. But what they did hope for was the presence of God. He suggests that we have to learn, first of all, to want God before we can dare to want life after death. Because otherwise we might want life after death for its own sake. Life after death because we just don't want to die. And life after death without the presence of God, life after death which is not longed for because we long fundamentally to be in God's presence, that kind of immortality is not the immortality of the resurrection, but the immortality of the undead. But you and I, because we have encountered the risen Christ, know that true Christian hope is about that presence of God. It's about God being present with us to the extent that he shares his very life with us. Present with us, present within us, working within us by the power of his Holy Spirit to make us into the presence of God in the world, the living and life-giving presence of God in the world. That is our Christian hope. And so it is that St. Peter can say in our second reading, God raised Christ from the dead and gave him glory so that our faith and our hope are in God. We do not long merely to carry on. We do not long merely to escape death. But what we long for is God himself. And that is what he has given us in the person of Jesus Christ. And the disciples discover in today's gospel that the presence of Jesus Christ comes to us in all sorts of ways, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes unrecognized. It comes to us in the breaking of bread, and that's why we come to Mass. It comes to us in our prayer. It comes to us in our loving service of one another. It comes to us in the Scriptures if we allow Christ working within us to open them for us, to enable us to find in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself and concerning how he has transformed and made sense of our lives.